next set of options that we chose, the test steps with the database validation steps. So we'll go ahead and open this test case up. Now, as you can see here, this one looks very different than the other test case. We have our web service execution step here with the 2 assertions in it. However, on this step, we also have a data set. And if we open the data set, we can see that some of the data that was in the request in the previous type of step and just the test steps is now being assigned to properties here in this data set. We can scroll through here. We can see that the data is now coming through as properties. Another important one is the JDBC connect URL. That property is being defined here in the data set as well. And it has the DB server and the DB port properties, which are also defined in the config file as well. So the data set is stored down here in the data folder, and each one of these test cases here that have the database validation step now have a data set that goes with it. And this data set controls what request is sent to the system, and it also provides the environmental properties needed for the test steps to connect to the database as well. And we have the same assert code, response code equals, and assert response equals that we did in the other test steps, so that process is the same. But once it gets that response back from the system for this web service execution, it also has the ability to go in, and you can see it's got insert users, insert accounts to, addresses, and at a granular level it's going to go in and it's going to validate the different sets or different pieces of data that collectively made up this request here, and it's going to ensure that they actually made it into the database. So we'll go ahead and open one of these steps here, and we can see the SQL statement that's being used, and we can see these properties which were coming out of the data set that have the values assigned from the data set. You can also see the JDBC connect URL, which that value is also coming out of this data set as well, in combination with the project config file. So what it's going to do here is it's going to go ahead and invoke the system based on the SQL query, and then it also has an assertion, ensure the result set size. And what it's going to do, this right here is the minimum number of rows that are allowed. So it needs to be at least 1 row. And then the next one is the maximum number of rows. So this would be a -1, which means that there can be infinite number of rows, but there needs to be at least 1 row, and then there can be as many more after that. So this is going to go through and make sure that it does bring back at least 1 row that matches that SQL query. And if it doesn't, then it will generate an error and say something is wrong here. So this is the same for each one of these steps here. It's going to go in and it's going to validate different parts. So here we're looking at the accounts, available balance. Here we're looking at accounts again. And there's different accounts in the data being set up, such as a checking and a saving. So it's going to go through and just validate all the different pieces, the address, all the different pieces of data that made up that request. It's going to systematically and in a granular fashion go through and verify that they did in fact make it to the database. Okay, now let's look at a baseline test case using a transaction frame step. So again, we've got the expanded baselines with transaction steps here. We'll open the first one up, and you can see very much like the test step test cases, we have a single step, and this one is an execution transaction frame step. And we also have an assertion in here, assert response equals, very similar to the test step, but we don't have the assert response code equals, so we're just checking the response in this case. And if we open this up, we can see that the executing agent is a property. So it's going to pull the agent based off of a property that was sent to the config file or written to the config file, and it is the JBoss Lisa Bank, and this is being pulled from the data from CA. And then we can also see we have the request here. And then we also have in the response, take a look, and this is the response, and it does a comparison here And you can see it's showing major differences because there's nothing in the right column, but it will populate the right column so you can view the differences if you'd like here. But the real assertion takes place in this assert response equals. And this is similar to the other test case where we have the hard-coded response, the expected or the baseline value, and then it's going to take what is from that right column that we saw in the step itself, that response that it gets back. It's going to assign it to the property last response, populate the test side, and then assert that they're the same. And if they aren't, if it turns out false, then go ahead and fail the test. But again, the big difference here is that the actual invoking of the system under test is being taken place by the agent and not the simulator server. And this would be used in the case where there are components of an application where it is not possible to invoke it externally, that you actually have to be inside the JVM to invoke that's part of the system. So for those type of transactions, you can use these transaction frame steps and successfully go ahead and invoke the system under test and get a response back. Now that we've gone through the three different types of expanded baseline test cases that have been created, let's go ahead and look at one of the suite documents that are also auto-generated. So all these suite documents are actually the same in the sense that they just load up the 10, in our case, the 10 baseline test cases that are going to be used to invoke the system under test and verify that everything is working properly. And it is going to run them serially, so meaning one after the other. And it's got some default settings in here as far as the suite name goes. Each one of them has a staging document assigned to it, a coordinator server, and if needed, you can go in and customize each of these and how they execute if you'd like, which is one of the advantages of having this type of baseline test case setup where you have multiple test cases. You can configure how you want each one of these to run, say potentially using a different staging document or something like that, but you're getting a very similar test happening. But the advantage of having this suite document created is that you can just run the suite document and it'll run all the test cases for you, so you don't have to do them one at a time. And again, it creates a suite document each time you generate a set of baseline test cases in the expanded version, and it uses the unique identifying name that you assign to it at the time of creation, so you can tell which suite document goes with which set of test cases. So now I've opened up a project here that was used to generate the baselines, which are the data-driven style baselines. So first thing you'll notice is there's not a folder called baselines here. You still have the virtual services folder at the top. If we go down into the test folder, we can then see that there are 3 data-driven baseline test cases generated here. And if we open up the staging docs and the suite docs, we can see that everything is still the default here. And same with the audit docs, and no sub-processes. So when you create the data-driven baseline test cases, you don't get the baseline folder, you don't get the folder with the unique name on it. Instead, you get the test cases put right into the test folder, and the unique name that you identify that with when you create the test case is used in the name of the test case itself. So it doesn't have baseline-1 or baseline-10 like the other ones do. And the other important item is that there is a data set for each one of these test cases, because this is what gives it the name data-driven. The data in these test cases will be driven by a data set. So instead of the data being hard-coded into the test case, it's actually going to be in a data set, which makes it more flexible. If you want to change out the data that's used by the test case, you can just update the data set. So let's go ahead and open up the first one here using the test steps. And we can see it's very similar to the other test step-based expanded baseline test case where we have a single test step, and because we chose to create baselines on web service execution, we've got a web service execution XML test step here. But this time we have a data set, and the data set is attached to the test step. And if we go ahead and open it up, we can see in here, again, we've got data being assigned to properties. The column headers are the properties. So we can see these are the URLs are going to be used to access the environment. And if we look in the properties and we look into the config properties, we can see that this data has been added into the project config file. So we see the WS server and the WS port, and both of those are here in the project config file. So that's where that data is coming from. And we can also see the content type, request body, expected response, and response code. So if we open up the request body and look at the extended view here, we can see that we've got a request very similar to what we saw in the other test cases. And we can also see that we have the expected response here. And we have this data for each one of the transactions that we put on the shelf, and it's all contained inside the data set itself, and then assigned to properties. So if we look at the test step, we can see that there's this URL property, and that is coming out of the data set as well. And the test step is still a web service execution step, but we can see that the request body here is also a property. So instead of seeing all of the request data here like we did in the other test cases, now we can see that the request body property is what's handling all of that data. So what this does is make these type of test cases more flexible for changing out the data set. So if you have something you want to continue to reuse, say this add user object, you can switch out the data very easily just by switching the data set, because everything is controlled by properties. And again, if we look at the assert response code, we can see that the response code property is being used. And if we look at the assert response equals, we can see the expected result is also property along with that last response property. So the behavior itself actually is the same as the expanded baseline test cases, but in this case, properties are being used to populate the different areas of the test case for validation, and it just makes it a lot more flexible. Okay, next let's look at the transaction steps test case. We'll open this up. And very much like the previous test case we just looked at with the test step, again we have the execute transaction frame step, and we have a data set associated with it, and we have the assertion that only asserts that the response equals the expected result, or the expected response. And if we go ahead and open the data set here, we can see the transaction frame information that's assigned to that property, and we can see the expected result. So if we launch the extended view, we can see this is the request that's going to be sent in, and it's got all the data in it, similar to what we've looked at already. And then we have our expected result that we can format and look at, and all this will be also assigned to a property. So again, the data set contains the information for each of the 10 transactions, and this data set lives inside this data set over here in the data folder. And in the step itself, we also have, again, the agent name, which is coming out of the config file, the project config file. And we can see the agent name here is a JBoss Lisa Bank. And then we have the assert response equals, and we have the property expected result that gets loaded, or the value gets assigned through the data set, and the last response property, which value is assigned based on the last response of this step. And then it compares them, and if they're not the same, it generates an error. So it's very similar to the test step, other than once again, the transaction frame step uses the agent to invoke the system under test and not the simulator server. And now let's go ahead and take a look at a test case that uses a test template to add additional steps to the test case. So we can see here, we have the add user object, which we use to create the baseline test case from. This is data driven, so it has a data set attached to it. And in addition, we have this CAI template placeholder, which is a do nothing step. And the do nothing step just tells CAI when it's building the test case to place the steps from the test case immediately after it. And then we have the delete user step. And this was originally after the CAI template placeholder, but when the baseline was created, it inserted this test step here, And we can see that it's going to cycle through, it's going to add the 10 users, and it's going to move on to this step where it's actually going to delete the 10 users. So this is a very small example of how to add additional steps to a baseline test case. So some practical uses would be if you have a test case where you need to log in and create a state. This is how you can add those steps that would create the state prior to the transaction that you're going to use to create the baseline from. So in a lot of ways, this behaves like inserting a sub-process. If you're familiar with CA application test, it's sort of a way to add a sub-process in. You can reuse a test case inside of another test case. But unlike a sub-process, it actually is going to keep all these steps embedded in here in this test case itself. So you can't go out and edit the main test case that this came from, and it'll update here. The steps are embedded into the test case itself. So this is a really useful way to auto-generate not only your baseline test cases, but more robust baseline test cases that could potentially also have functional test steps or test steps that create a state for your baseline steps to function properly. So now that we've looked at these test cases in DevTest Workstation, let's look at the artifacts in the DevTest portal. So right here on the screen, I have the Baselines Expanded project open, which we looked at earlier. And I have the Manage All Resources tab open. And this is showing all the artifacts in this project. So I have them sorted by their grouping name. And this is actually an important point when it comes to looking for the baseline test cases. If you notice, the name of the artifact here is not very identifiable. It's a bunch of baseline test cases that have baseline -1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And because we made a total of 30 of them, there are many baseline test cases that have the actual same name. Now, in DevTest Workstation, they are in a folder. Where you need to look in the portal to identify which test case goes with which output is in the grouping column. And here we can see the grouping column actually shows the folder or the folder structure. We've got the baselines folder, which we saw in DevTest Workstation, and we also have the name that we created when we created the test case. So we can see all these test cases, and if we keep scrolling, then under the name we can see the test suites, and these do have the unique names that we gave them when we created the test cases. So in the DevTest portal, when you do expanded baselines, this is important to note that the grouping column is the column you're going to use to find which baseline test case goes with which output. So now let's go ahead and look at the data-driven test cases. And we can see here that the grouping is not showing because it's not in a subfolder. And we can see the test case names because they are in the test folder. The test case itself has the name that we gave it when we created the baselines. It's a little bit easier here to identify the baseline data-driven test cases in the DevTest portal. Don't need to worry so much about the grouping. But something to keep in mind is we're in the All Resources tab here, and things that don't show up in this view are config files and data sets. So while you don't see them in the portal, by reviewing all this information, you also know that those config files and data sets are also available and are a part of these test cases. So if you need to go in and configure those items, you'll need to go ahead and open these test cases in the DevTest Workstation, and then you can edit the test cases, the data sets, and all the other artifacts as needed.